We're going to continue our web development journey and explore HTML in more detail. So in this section, we're going to cover the essential HTML elements you need to know to build web pages. You will learn all the elements used for displaying text, links, images, lists, tables, as well as container and structural or semantic elements. Even if you know the basics of HTML, I would still encourage you to watch this section thoroughly because a lot of people don't use these elements the right way. So let's jump in and get started. Earlier in the course, I told you that we use the head section to give browsers and search engines information about a web page. So let's explore it in a bit more detail. I'm going to start with a blank document. Now let me show you a cool trick. If we type an exclamation mark and then press tab, we get a basic HTML boilerplate, which means a basic HTML template. So on the top, we have our doc type declaration. Below that, we have our HTML element with the lang attribute, which is a common best practice. Next, we have our head section with a bunch of elements we're going to talk about in a second, followed by the body section. So this is a very basic HTML boilerplate. Now, what do we have in the head section? Well, we have a couple of meta elements for giving information about this web page. The first meta element is for defining the character set. What is a character set? Well, computers don't understand characters like A, B, C, and so on. They only understand numbers which are represented in the binary format, zeros and ones. So using a character set, we can map a character to a numeric value. The first character set that was designed was the ASCII character set, which is short for American Standard Code for Information Interchange. ASCII can only represent the characters in the English language, so it's very limited. So over here, different character sets have been created to represent more characters in international languages. The character set that we use most of the time these days is UTF-8, which can represent almost all characters in the world. So back to our code. With this meta element, we're defining the character set used in this HTML document, okay? Now, below that, we have a meta element for configuring the viewport. The viewport is the visible area of a web page. So it is this area over here. Obviously, on a mobile device or on a tablet, our viewport is smaller. But here on desktop, we can change the size of the viewport by resizing the browser. So now our viewport is smaller, okay? Now back to our code. With this element, we're defining the initial width and zoom factor for the viewport. We'll talk about this in more detail in the future. For now, all I want you to know is that we need this element so our web pages look good on all devices, mobiles, tablets, and desktop computers. So as a best practice, every web page should have at least these two meta elements. But we have additional meta elements. Let me show you. So if we type meta, in this list, you can see all possible meta elements. For example, we have this element for defining keywords on a web page. So let's select this. Here we can type multiple keywords like HTML, CSS, and so on. In the past, these keywords were heavily used for search engine optimization, but these days, most search engines don't put too much weight on these keywords, but we can still use them to define the keywords that represent this page. We have another meta element for defining a description for this page. So if you type meta:desk and then press tab or enter, here we can type a description for this page. What we type here will appear on Google or other search engines when someone searches for our website. For example, if we search for Apple, here's what we get. Now look at this text. What you see here comes from this element over here. So this is the purpose of meta elements. With these meta elements, we can give information about a web page. All right, next we're going to talk about the elements you need to know for working with text. All right, now let's talk about the most common elements for working with text. So you learn about the P or paragraph element, which we use for displaying some text. So here I'm going to say, I love to teach you HTML. Now, sometimes we want to emphasize a part of our text. Let's say the HTML word here. To do that, we can wrap it inside an M or emphasis element. So here I type M, press tab. Here's the emphasis element. Let's hover over it and see what the tooltip says. It says the M element represents stress emphasis of its content. So whenever we want to emphasize some content, we can wrap it inside the M element. So in this case, I'm going to move HTML inside these tags. Now, let's save the changes. Here's what we get. So by default, browsers display emphasized content in italic. But don't assume that whenever you want to display italic content, you should use the M element. Because the purpose of the M element is to emphasize content in our HTML document. And this helps search engines extract important content in our documents. Anything to do with styling should be done in CSS. For example, here we can change the default style of emphasized elements and remove the italic. Let me show you. So in the head section, we add the style element. And here we define a rule for emphasized content. We can set the color to red and font style to normal. Now, don't worry about memorizing any of these CSS properties. We're going to go over them multiple times throughout the course. But let's see what happens now that we apply these styles. So our emphasized content is displayed in red and is no longer italic. Now, in the past, we had an element called I, which was short for italic. If we use this element, we get the same result as before. Our content is displayed in italic. But this element is considered deprecated because HTML is not meant for styling. It should only be used for structuring content. So don't use the I element to display content as italic, okay? Now we have a similar element in HTML called strong. Let's hover over it and see what the tooltip says. The strong element represents strong importance, seriousness, or urgency of its contents. Conceptually, it's kind of similar to the emphasis element. So where you should use it really depends on your context, on your content. Now let's save the changes and see what we get. So by default, strong elements are displayed as bold. But once again, we can always change the styling. Now in the past, we had another element called B, which is short for bold. So whenever we wanted to make something bold, we use this element. But once again, this element is considered deprecated because styling should be done in CSS and not in HTML, okay? So don't use B or I elements. Now, I'm going to remove this element and just add HTML. Let me show you a cool trick. Let's say we want to wrap this word with the M element. There is a shortcut for it. So on the top, we go to the View menu. Look at the shortcut for the command palette. On Mac, it's Shift, Command, and P. And on Windows, it's probably Shift, Control, and P. So let's select HTML and then bring up the command palette. With this command palette, we can execute commands in VS Code. So here I'm going to search for a command called wrap with abbreviation. That is the first command on the list. Now we press enter, and here we type the element that we want to use to wrap our selected content. In this case, M. Press enter, done. So I didn't have to manually create an M element and then move HTML inside it. It's very handy. So this is all about text. Now let's talk about headings. So in HTML, we have 6 heading elements. H1, we have H2, H3, H4, H5, and H6. So let's see what we get. So heading 1 represents the most important heading, and heading 6 represents the least important heading. Now, one common mistake that I see amongst a lot of people is that they choose these headings based on their size. So if they want to have a heading with this size, they would just use heading 4. That is not how you're supposed to use headings, because the size can always be changed with CSS. It's a matter of styling. We should use these headings to create a hierarchy. So every web page should have one and only one H1 element. This heading represents what this page is all about. Now, nothing happens if you have multiple H1 elements. For example, I can duplicate this line and say heading 1 plus. Now look, we have 2 H1 elements, but this is going to confuse search engines. They're not going to figure out what this page is really all about. So every page should have a single H1 element. So I'm going to remove this line. Now, after we use H1, then we should use H2. We should not jump to H4. So let's say on this page, we're going to have 2 sections, one for HTML, the other for CSS. So my next heading should be H2. And here we can type HTML. Obviously, below this heading, we can have some text. So I'm going to say HTML tutorial. Our next heading should be H2. So this is the CSS section. And in this section, we can have some additional text. Let's say CSS tutorial. Now I'm going to delete these 4 headings. So let's take a look. So we have a hierarchy. On the top, we have an H1 element. Below that, we have 2 H2 elements. Now let's say in this section, we're going to have 2 subsections. There we should use H3 elements. So here's our HTML section. In this section, we're going to have 2 H3 elements. Let's say code and exercise. Now take a look. So we have a hierarchy. This is how we should use these heading elements. The better we can represent the structure of our document using HTML, the better search engines can read and understand our content. So that's all about text. Next, we're going to talk about displaying special characters in HTML. Some characters are reserved in HTML, and to display them, we have to use a special notation. For example, let's say we want to wrap the word HTML with angle brackets. See what's going to happen. So I type a left angle bracket and a right angle bracket. See what happened? VS Code thought we were adding an HTML element, so it automatically generated the closing tag. We don't want this, so let's delete it. Now, back in the browser, look, where's our HTML word? It's not here because the browser interpreted this as an HTML tag. This is not what we want. We want to display this exactly as is. So to solve this problem, we're going to use HTML entities. All these entities start with an ampersand and end with a semicolon. In between these 2 characters, we type a few characters that determine the type of the HTML entity. So we have an entity for displaying the less than sign. That is LT, short for less than. Now let's remove this. Similarly, we have another HTML entity for displaying the greater than sign. So we type an ampersand GT, which is short for greater than, followed by a semicolon. Now, back to the browser. That's exactly what we wanted. Perfect. Another common HTML entity is the copyright symbol. So at the end, I'm going to type an ampersand, copy, and a semicolon. Now take a look. Here's our copyright symbol. Beautiful. Now we have so many entities in HTML, and quite frankly, you don't need to memorize any of them. In fact, you're not going to use 99% of them. But in case you're curious, let me show you the complete list. So on Google, search for HTML entities. And on this second link, dev.w3.org, you can see the complete list of these entities. So as you can see, there are so many entities, and honestly, I have never used any of them. The only ones I have used are these 3 plus non-breaking space. Let me show you what that is about. So I'm going to delete this line and generate some dummy text. So we add a paragraph element. Now to generate some dummy text, we type lorem, followed by the number of words we want to generate. Let's say 50. Tab. Look, this is some dummy text in Latin. Now let's preview it in the browser. So here's what we get. Let's imagine that the last word on the first line and the first word on the second line should be stick together. Here we have a line break in between these 2 words. We want to prevent that. So I'm going to copy this word. Now, here in VS Code, let's bring up the search panel by pressing Command and F on Mac or Control and F on Windows. Now we paste this word. Okay, here it is. We want to make sure that these 2 words are always together. There is no line break in between them. So I'm going to replace this regular space with a non-breaking space, which is an HTML entity. So we type an ampersand, NBSP, which is short for non-breaking space, followed by a semicolon. Now take a look. So both these words are on the second line. So this is all about HTML entities. Next, we're going to talk about links. Almost every web page on the internet has links to other pages or websites. To create these links, we use the anchor element. So we type A, that is short for anchor, and then press tab. Now every anchor element should have an href attribute. Href is short for hypertext reference. I know, it's a mouthful, It basically means a URL or a link. So for this demo, I'm going to create a second page called about.html and then link to it over here. So here in the Explorer panel, let's add a new page called about.html. Now here we're going to create a basic HTML boilerplate. Remember how to do that? We type an exclamation mark and then press tab. That's it. Beautiful. Now back to index.html. Here we can use a relative or an absolute URL. What do you mean by that? Well, a relative URL starts from the current page. So currently we are on index.html and we want to go to about.html. Now, currently both these pages are in the same folder. So we can type a relative URL to about.html like this, about.html. That's a relative URL. Now, what if about.html was in a different folder? So let's add a new folder to our project called company, and then move about to this folder. Now, where is about.html relative to the current page? It's inside the company folder, right? So here we type company/about.html. This is a relative URL. Now let's give this link a text. I'm going to say about me. So we type our text inside the anchor element, okay? Save the changes, back to the browser. Here's our link, click, and we're currently on the about page, which is empty. Beautiful. Now back to our home page. Instead of a text, we can also use an image. So I'm going to delete about me and add an image element. So img tab. Once again, here we can type a relative URL to our target image. So I'm going to go with images/mosh.jpg. Now save, take a look. Obviously, this image is way too big. We can always use CSS to resize it. But that aside, look at the mouse icon when we hover over this image. It changed to a hand to indicate that this image is clickable, okay? Now, back to our code. To keep things simple, I'm going to get rid of this image and get back to our text, about me. Now let's go to the about page and add a link back to the home page. So over here, we're going to add an anchor element. What should we type for the href attribute? Well, currently we are inside the company folder. We have to go one level up so we can access index.html, right? To do that, we type double periods and a /. With this, we can go one level up. Now at this level, which is the root of our website, we have the company folder, the images folder, and index.html. So we can reference index.html. And for the text, we're going to say homepage. Again, this is another example of a relative URL because it starts from the current page and goes somewhere else. Now, if we're inside a deeply nested folder structure, we might have to go multiple levels up. So double period and a /, then we repeat and repeat. With this, we can go 3 levels up. Now, as you can see, URLs like this kind of look messy. They look hard to read. In those cases, we can use an absolute URL. So we start with a /, and this represents the root of our website. Now, at this level, we have access to index.html. So this is an absolute URL, okay? Now, back to index.html. Here we are linking to an HTML document, but we can also link to non-HTML documents like images, PDFs, PowerPoints, and so on. So let's add a link to my image. So for the href, I'm going to say images/mosh.jpg. And for the text, I'm going to say my photo. Save, take a look. So here's our second link, click. My image is displayed in the browser. But what if I want to prompt the user to download it? That's very easy. We're going to add the download attribute to our anchor element. So we type download, press enter. Now this attribute doesn't have a value, so we can remove the double quotes and the equal sign. So we just add the attribute name. Now save, back to the browser. We go back. Here we have to manually refresh the page because the live server only refreshes the current page. Now previously we were on my image, so that was the URL that live server refreshed. So here we refresh to get the latest changes. Now when I click on this link, instead of seeing my image, we're going to see my image getting downloaded. Take a look, click, and here's my image. Beautiful. Now we can also link to other parts of this page. So let's create 2 sections with a lot of text. So I'm going to add an h2 element. Of course, I missed the h1, but let's not worry about it. For this H2, we're going to say HTML. And below that, we're going to add some dummy text with 200 words. So paragraph, lorem, 200. Good. Now, right after that, we're going to add another H2 for the CSS section with some more text. Okay. Let's save the changes. Take a look. As we can see, the CSS section is below the fold. So we have to scroll down to see it. What we can do here is on the top, we can add a link to the CSS section. So when the user clicks on that, they will immediately jump to the CSS section. That is very easy. So here's the CSS section. First, we have to give this element a unique identifier. Just like everyone in the real world can have a unique identifier, like a driver's license or a passport, every element on a page can also have a unique identifier. So here I'm going to set the ID attribute to CSS, or we can use a more descriptive name like section-CSS. The name doesn't really matter here. What matters is that we're defining what is called a fragment or a place on this page. Now, we're going to add a link to this fragment. So on the top, let's add another anchor element. Now for the href, we're going to type a # followed by the name of our fragment, which is section-CSS. And for the text, we're going to say CSS. Now, back to the browser, take a look. I'm going to click on this. We immediately jump to the CSS section. Beautiful. Now, a lot of websites like this also have a link that helps you jump to the top of the page. Let's see how we can create that. So after the CSS section, I'm going to add another anchor element. Now for the href, I'm going to use an empty fragment. So we just type a # without an identifier. And then we say jump to top. Take a look. So here's our link, click, and now we're on top of the page. Now let's see how we can link to external websites. So let's add another anchor element to link to Google. Now what should we type here? Well, google.com is a different website. So here we cannot use a relative URL. We have to use an absolute URL. But if you start with a /, we're referencing the root of our website. But in this case, we want to go to a different website. How can we do that? Well, we have to start with the protocol. So https://google.com. Now let's type Google and test our page. Click. We're on Google. Beautiful. Now sometimes when linking to external websites, we want that link to open in a new browser window or a new tab. Let me show you how to do that. So here's our anchor. We set the target attribute to _blank. Save. Now, back to the homepage. Once again, we have to manually refresh to get the latest changes. Okay. Now, when I click on Google, you see a new tab. Beautiful. And one last thing. We can also link to emails. So I'm going to add an anchor. And for href, I'm going to say mail to : programmingwithmosh@gmail.com. Email me. Save the changes. Now, back to our page. When I click on this link, my mail client will open and my email address will be pre-populated. Take a look. So click, and here's my mail client. So this is all about links. Now, one last thing before we finish this lesson. What is the difference between a link and a hyperlink? Well, a link is just an address, a URL, the location of the target page. A hyperlink is the element that the user can click on to navigate to that target page. That is the difference between a link and a hyperlink. But quite often, these terms are used interchangeably. All right, we're done with this lesson. Next, we're going to talk about images. All right, now let's talk about embedding images in a bit more detail. For this lesson, I'm going to grab an image from unsplash.com, which is where we can find a lot of beautiful and freely usable images. So let's search for coffee. There are tons of coffee pictures here. I'm going to grab this picture. We can download it for free. Now look, this image comes in different sizes: small, medium, and large. For now, we're going to grab this image in a small size. But in the future, we're going to talk about embedding images at different sizes depending on the device. So on mobile devices, we want to serve a smaller image, and on desktop computers, we want to serve a larger image. For now, let's not worry about these complexities. We'll have a complete section on this topic later on. So Let's download the small image. Now it says, say thank you to Nathan. Thanks, Nathan. This is a beautiful picture. You have done a great job. Now I'm going to drag and drop this image onto the images folder and then rename it to coffee. We want to give it a descriptive name. This is a small search engine optimization tip. When we provide descriptive names for our images, search engines can better understand and index our pages, okay? So here's our image. Now, let's add an image element. We set the source to images/coffee.jpg. Now, what about the alt attribute? Well, I briefly mentioned that we use this attribute to provide textual description of the image. It's not compulsory, but is highly recommended for a number of reasons. The first reason is to make our page accessible to visually impaired people. These people use a screen reader to read the web out to them. So with this alternative text, we can tell them what we are showing on the page. And that means we should write a good, meaningful description here, like a coffee mug on a table. Don't write something like image or image1. That is pointless. Now, the second benefit of providing an alternative text is that we help search engines read this text and understand what we're providing here. And there's one more benefit. If this image cannot be loaded for some reason, the alternative text is shown. Let me show you what I mean. So I'm going to add a typo here. Now, back to the browser. Look, the image is not loaded, but we see the alternative text. This can also happen if there is a network connectivity issue. If the user gets disconnected, they can still see the alternative text. So let's remove the typo. Now let's talk about sizing images. As I told you before, we can use CSS to resize our images. So here in the head section, let's add a style element and apply a rule to our image. Now this rule is applied to all images on the page. This is probably not something we want to do in a real world scenario. In a real world scenario, we want to apply a class to this element and then define rules for that class. We'll talk about this in more detail in the future. So for now, let's give this image a width of 200 pixels and a height of 200 pixels. Now, there's a tiny problem in our image. Can you tell? Our image is kind of squashed. Here's the reason. We're dealing with a rectangular image. Look, this is a rectangular image, but we're converting it to a square image. Now look at the shape of this coffee mug. It's kind of round, right? Like compared with what we have over here. Our image is vertically squashed. Let me show you another way to verify this. We can right-click on the image and then go to Inspect. This opens Chrome DevTools and selects our image in the DOM. Now on the right side, we can see the styles that we apply to this element. Now I'm going to disable the height property, and I want you to pay close attention to the image and see how the shape changes. So look, now the coffee mug is more round, but if I apply the height property, it becomes squashed. So how can we solve this problem? Well, we have a new property in CSS called object fit. So here we can set object fit to one of these values. Most of the time we use cover, so the image covers its containing box. What is this containing box? Well, first let me set this to cover. Here we have this image element, right? Conceptually, there is a box around every element in an HTML document. We don't see this box, but the browser uses that box to figure out how the page should be displayed. So here we have a box with this dimension, 200 by 200. And in this box, we're trying to insert this image, right? Now, when we set object fit to cover, our image will get resized and potentially cropped so it covers the entire containing box. Let's verify this. So save the changes and back in the browser. Look, our coffee mug is round, but if I disable the object fit property, it gets squashed again. So object fit is a very useful property. Now we can always play with all possible values over here. So I'm going to select this, delete it. Now using the up and down arrows, we can go through this list and see the impact of every value. Now I'm not going to go over all these values and explain what they mean. This is pointless. You can always figure them out on your own. Just remember that most of the time we use cover. So the image covers the entire containing box. All right, this is all about the images for now. Next, we're going to talk about video and audio. In HTML5, we have great support for embedding video and audio. Here's a real example. On sketch.com, we can see a video showcasing how this tool works. Now, this video doesn't have any control buttons like play and pause, but we can easily add them. So let me show you how to embed video and audio in your web pages. For this lesson, we're going to go to pexels.com. This is another website where you can find plenty of beautiful free photos and videos. So I'm going to search for ocean. And then on the top, select videos. So let's grab this video over here. Now, just like unsplash.com, we can download this video for free at different sizes. For this lesson, I'm going to download the HD version, which is smaller. We don't want to embed a large video file because if the user is on a slow connection, they're going to have a really bad experience watching the video. So let's download the smallest version. And of course, we should say thanks to Ruvim or Ravim, I don't know how to say their name. And I'm going to send them a donation right after this video. So here's our video file. Now in our project, I'm going to create a new folder called videos, and then drag and drop this new video into this folder. Now let's rename this to ocean, so the name is more descriptive. Now back to index.html. To embed a video, use the video element. Now just like the image element, here we have the source attribute. So we set it to videos/ocean.mp4. So once again, we have a relative URL, but we could also use an absolute URL that starts with a /. Now let's save the changes and see what we get. All right, here's what we get. By default, we just see an image of the video, and this image is shown at the full size, which is larger than my browser window over here. So we have horizontal scrolling, which is really bad. So let's use CSS to change the size of this video. Here in the head section, we add a style element and define a rule for our video. I'm going to set the width to 400 pixels. Now, we don't have to set the height here. The browser will automatically calculate the height based on the aspect ratio of the video. So here's what we get. That's a lot better. Now let's add the control buttons. Now to show the control buttons, all we have to do is to apply the controls attribute. This attribute is what we call a Boolean attribute. If you have done any programming, you probably know Boolean values, which can be true or false. Now, a lot of people have a misconception about Boolean attributes in HTML. They assume that they can set these attributes to true or false. Well, that is not correct. Here's the reason. If we set this to false, the browser will still show the control buttons. Let's verify this. So save, and back in the browser, here's the play button. We can also change the volume. We can make this full screen and so on. So this is not the way Boolean attributes work in HTML. The presence of a Boolean attribute represents the true value, and its absence represents the false value. So all we have to do to show the control buttons is to add the attribute. The value we set is irrelevant. Now we have another Boolean attribute called autoplay. As the name suggests, when we apply this attribute, the video automatically starts when our page is loaded. This is exactly like the video you saw on sketch.com. The video automatically started without me explicitly playing it. Another useful Boolean attribute you should know is loop. When we apply this attribute, the video will automatically loop. So this is how we can embed video in our web pages. Now, these days, most browsers have excellent support for the video element, but there is still one browser that doesn't support the video element. Let me show you. We go to caniuse.com. On this website, we can find out how different browsers support various HTML and CSS features. So let's search for video. Now the first item here is video tracks, which is used for displaying subtitles. Now look at this table. We have a lot of red boxes, which means the majority of browsers out there don't support this feature. So let's move on and look at the video element. We have a lot of green boxes, only a few red boxes. For example, Firefox version 2 or 3 don't support this feature, but this is a really old browser. It was mainly used between 2006 and 2008. Now look at the total usage of this browser in the world. It's 0.01%, really, really low. So I'm not worried about this browser. All the other versions of Firefox have perfect support for the video element. The only browser that doesn't support the video element is Opera Mini, which was released in 2015, and currently is used by 0.88% of the users in the world. I'm not personally familiar with this browser, but what we need to do with our video element is to provide a fallback text if their browser doesn't support the video element. So back to the code, inside the video element, we can provide our fallback text and say, your browser doesn't support videos. This is a common best practice. Now, what about audio? Well, we have another element for adding audio. It's exactly like the video element. So we specify the source, and we also have these Boolean attributes. So that's all about video and audio. Next, we're going to talk about lists. Okay, now let's talk about adding lists. In HTML, we have three types of list elements. The type that we use most of the time is UL, which is short for unordered list. We use this element whenever we want to show a list of items where the order doesn't matter. A common application of this element is in implementing navigation menus. Quite often, these navigation menus are represented using unordered lists. But we can use unordered lists for listing any type of objects where the order doesn't matter. We can list images, products in a shopping cart, and so on. So for this demo, let's say we want to create a navigation menu with 4 links. Inside this UL element, we add 4 LI elements. LI is short for list item. So the first item is going to be about me. Now here I'm using plain text, but we can add a hyperlink using the anchor element. Let's not worry about that and just focus on this structure. So let's add another list item, say courses, subscribe, and contact me. Let's see what we get. So by default, list items are displayed using bullet points. But these bullet points are a matter of styling. We can change their shape, we can change circles to squares, or we can remove them. That's something we do in CSS. Let me show you. So here in the style element, let's define a rule for our unordered list. Here we set list style type to a square. And with this, the shape of our bullet points changed to a square. Now, if you want to remove these, we set this property to none. The bullet points are gone. We can also use CSS to lay these out horizontally, just like this navigation menu over here. But that's a matter of styling. We'll talk about that later in the course. In this section, our focus is mainly on HTML for structuring our web pages. So this is how we can create an unordered list. Now we can also nest lists to create a hierarchy. For example, let's say here I want to display 3 of my courses in another unordered list. So after courses, we add another unordered list, and inside this list, we're going to have 3 list items. Now let me show you a cool technique for quickly generating markup. We want to create 3 list items, right? So we type li times 3 and then press tab. This is called Zen coding. So let's list a few of my courses here: HTML, JavaScript, and Git. Now, here's what we get. We have a hierarchy of items. So this is all about unordered lists. Now, in contrast, we have ordered lists where the order of items matter. So if you change the order, the meaning can change. Let me show you an example. So I'm going to delete this unordered list and create an ordered list using the OL element. Now, inside this list, we're going to have 3 list items. So once again, we type li times 3, but there's a shortcut to create all of this markup in one go. So I'm going to delete all of this. So we start with an OL. Inside this OL, we're going to have 3 list items. So li times 3. Isn't that awesome? So what is a real example? Let's say we have a website for recipes. So our first item can be preheat the oven. Then we can say, place the ingredients on the crust. Let's say this is a recipe for making pizzas. The third step can be put the pizza in the oven for 20 minutes and so on. With this markup, we get this output. So instead of bullet points, we have 1, 2, 3. So this is all about ordered lists. Now we have a third type of lists called description lists. So I'm going to delete all this markup. We use description lists for implementing glossaries or display metadata. So we can have a term and some details about that term. Let me show you how this works. So we start with a DL element, which is short for description list. Now inside this list, we can have a description term, let's say HTML. And after this, we can add a description details element to describe this term. So here we can say hypertext markup language. Now, after that, we can add another term, let's say CSS, followed by some details. We can say this is short for cascading style sheets. So here's the default representation of a description list. But once again, we can use CSS to lay this out in a different way. For example, we can make the term bold and bigger. We can add some padding and so on. Now you might say, but Mosh, how often do we implement glossaries? Well, let me show you another real-world application of description lists. Let's say we want to display metadata about my course. So I'm going to change HTML to course or title. And then here, I add the title of this course. What is the title of this course? The Ultimate HTML and CSS course. The next term is author. And here we can provide details about the author, Mosh Hamedani. Then we can add another term called skills. These are the skills you're going to learn in this course. Then here we can list multiple details. So I'm going to type DD times 3. In this course, you're going to learn HTML, CSS, responsive design. Let's add another details item, search engine optimization. Now take a look. This is a real example of displaying metadata about something. So that's all about lists. Next, we're going to talk about tables. All right, let's see how we can create tables. So we have this table element for representing tabular data. In the past, we used this element for laying out pages, but these days that's considered a bad practice because we have better ways for creating layout. We'll talk about them later in the course. So just remember, the table element should only be used for displaying tabular data, like this table over here. So in this table, we're going to have one or more rows. To define a row, we use the TR or table row element. In this element, we can have one or more cells, which can be data cells or header cells. Let me show you the difference. So look at this table. In this table, we have a bunch of rows. In each row, we have 4 cells, 1, 2, 3, and 4. The cells in the first row are called header cells because here we have labels that define what each column represents. All the other cells in this table are called data cells because they contain data. So back to our code. In this row, we're going to have 2 data cells. To define a data cell, we use the TD element. That is short for table data cell. So in this cell, I'm going to say marketing. And let's define another cell. Here we can add the amount we spent on marketing. Let's say $100. Now let's define another row. But this time I'm going to use Zen coding. So we want a TR element. Inside this element, we want 2 TD elements. So TD times 2. Good. Now let's say accounting. And we spent $200 here. Save. So here's what we get. By default, our table doesn't have any styles. So here we don't have a border, we don't have background colors, and so on. But as you can tell, we can use CSS to style this table. So here in the style element, let's add a rule for our table element. So table, let's give this table a border. So we set border. Now here we have to type 3 values. The first value represents the thickness of the border. I want a really thin border, so I'm going to go with 1 pixel. The second value represents the style of the border. Our border can be a solid line, it can be a dashed line or a dotted line, and so on. So I'm going to go with a solid line. Next, we specify the color of the border. For this demo, I'm going to go with, let's say, gray. Okay, now take a look. So we have a border around the table element, but we also want a border around each cell, right? So back to our CSS, let's define a style for our TD element. Now here I'm going to copy this line and then paste it. But there's a problem in this code. If tomorrow we decide to change the color or the thickness or the style of the border, we have to make that change in 2 different places, over here and over here. So duplication in code is bad. That's why we have the dry principle in software engineering. Dry is short for don't repeat yourself. So we want to apply this style to both the table and TD elements. How? Super easy. Over here, we type a comma and then type the TD element. Now, all the styles that we define here will be applied to both these elements. And with this, we can get rid of the duplication. Good. So take a look. Here's what we get, but there's a tiny problem. Let me zoom in so you see clearly. We have some space between the borders of the neighboring cells. This looks ugly. Let me show you how to get rid of it. So back to our style, we have another property called border collapse. If we set this to collapse, this would collapse the borders in neighboring cells. Let me show you what I mean. So these two cells are neighbors, right? Currently, their borders are separated. Now, by applying border collapsing, these two borders will be collapsed into a single border. So back to our code, let's save the changes, and here's what we get. That's better. But there is another problem. We need some space around the data in each cell. Currently, our data is so close to the edges of each cell. So back to our CSS. Here we can set padding to, let's say, 5 pixels. Now we have some padding around the data in each cell. Much better. Now let's add a header to this table. So in this table, we're going to add another row. In this row, we're going to have 2 header cells. To define a header cell, use the th element. Th is short for table header cell. So th times 2. Look, we have the same structure as before, but instead of using the td element, we are using the th element, okay? Now in the first cell, I'm going to say category, and for the second cell, I'm going to say amount. Now, here's what we get. Of course, I've zoomed in here, so what you should see actually looks like this. So don't let that confuse you. Now, pay close attention to these header cells. These header cells have a different style from our data cells. They don't have a border, and they don't have padding either. So back to our CSS, let's apply these styles to our th elements as well. Save the changes. Here's what we get. That's better. So this is the basic way of defining a table. Now, there is nothing particularly wrong with this structure, but we can improve it and make it more meaningful to search engines and screen readers. So we want to tell search engines that in this table, we have 2 sections, a header and a body. To do that, we're going to use the thead and tbody elements. So inside the table, first we add a thead element that is short for table head. Then we should move the first row inside the thead element. Now let me show you how to select multiple lines using keyboard. So I'm going to hold down the shift button, and then using the down or up arrows, we can select multiple lines, okay? Now that we have selected these lines, we can hold down the alt key and then press up or down arrows to move code. Much easier. So we have a header section. Next, we should define the body section. So after thead, we add tbody, and then we move these 2 rows inside the body section. So like this. Good. We get the same output as before, but our markup is more meaningful to search engines and screen readers. This is what we call semantic HTML. Semantic means meaningful, okay? Now, inside this thead element, we can have multiple rows. So let me add another row. And in this row, I just want to add 1 cell, 1 header cell. Let's say expenses. So let's take a look. Here's our new cell. But what if I want to expand this cell so it goes up to here? That is very easy. Here's our header cell. In this element, we set the col span attribute to 2. Col span is short for column span, and it determines how many columns this cell should expand to. The default value is 1, but here we're saying 2, so this cell should take 2 columns. Now, take a look. That's better. So we have a header with 2 rows and a body. Now, optionally, we can add a footer. So after the tbody element, we add a tfoot element, and in this element, we add 1 row with 2 header cells. So tr greater than th times 2. In the first cell, I'm going to say total, and in the second cell, I'm going to say $300. Take a look. So that's our footer, and once again, we can have multiple rows in the footer to summarize data in different ways. Now, I have a question for you. What are the differences between header and data cells in terms of styling? Pause the video and think about it for a couple of seconds. Here's the answer. In header cells, by default, our text is bold and aligned in the center. In contrast, in data cells, our text is aligned to the left. But in this case, I want to align 300 to the left, so it perfectly aligns with these other numbers. How do we do that? Super easy. Back to our CSS, we want to define a rule for the t-foot element. Here I'm going to set text align to left. And now, all the cells in the footer are aligned to the left. Quite often, we need to group a bunch of elements for styling purposes. For example, here on adobe.com, look at this navigation bar on the top. In this navigation bar, we have an image and a bunch of menu items. So this navigation bar is a container for these elements. Here's another example. This is what we call a hero unit. This hero unit has a background image, a heading, some text, and a couple links. Here are more examples. Another container, and so on. So containers are used quite a lot in web pages. Let me show you how you can work with them. So in HTML, we have a few different container elements. The one that is most commonly used is the div or division element. Now this element doesn't have any visual appearance. So if we save the changes and go back to the browser, we see nothing because this is purely a container element. So here I'm going to add a paragraph and a hyperlink. Now, let's save the changes and go back to the browser. Once again, we don't see the div. We only see the text and the hyperlink. But we can use CSS to style this div. So here in the style element, we can define a rule for our div element, but this rule will apply to all divs or all containers on this page. This is not what we want. So here we can give this div a class. Let's say product. So let's imagine here we're showcasing a product that we're selling. Now we can change this selector to div.product. Now this rule will apply to all divs with the product class. Or we can make this code shorter and more flexible by removing div. So now we have a rule that will apply to any element with the product class. So if tomorrow we decide to change this div element and replace it with another kind of container, our CSS code will still work, okay? So here I'm going to set the background color to gold. Now, take a look. See what's happening? This div, this container, is filling up the entire width of the page, even though it has very little content. Why is this happening? Well, because the div element is a block level element. Block level elements always start on a new line and fill up the entire available space. So if we duplicate this div, the new div will appear on a new line. Let me show you how to do this. So I'm going to select these few lines. Now to duplicate these lines, we hold down the Shift, Alt, and the down arrow. Okay, save the changes and take a look. So block level elements start on a new line and fill up the entire available space. But we can use CSS to change their width. So over here, we can set the width to 300 pixels. Now take a look. Here's what we get. That's better. So this is all about divs. Now we have another generic container element called the span element, which is often used for styling text. Let me show you how it works. So I'm going to delete all this code. Now let's add a paragraph with some text. Let's say we want to highlight the first word here. We can wrap this word with a div, give that div a class like highlight, and then define a CSS rule for setting the background color of highlight elements. So let's wrap this with a div. Now we give this element a class like highlight, and then define a rule here for elements with the highlight class. Here we can set the background color to yellow. Let's see what we get. See what happened? Can you explain why we're getting this weird layout? Because divs are block level elements. So we wrap this word with a div, and this div is filling up the entire width of the page. This is where we can use the span element. The span element is a generic container like a div, but it's not a block level element. It's an inline element, which means it's not going to take up the entire width of the page. So back to the code, we want to replace both these div tags with a span. Let me show you another useful shortcut. So I've selected this div. Now to select the second div, we can press Command and D on Mac or Control and D on Windows. Look, Now we have multiple cursors. So we can replace both these tags in one go. We just type span and then press the escape button twice to disable multi-cursor editing. Okay, so now let's save the changes and back to the browser. Look, the first word is highlighted. So this is how we can use divs and spans. But in HTML5, we have a few more container elements that are more descriptive. We'll talk about them next. So as I told you, divs and spans are general purpose containers. But HTML5 introduced a few more container elements that are more descriptive or meaningful. We refer to these as semantic elements. So wherever possible, we should use these new elements instead of the generic containers like div and span, because this helps search engines better understand our pages and what they contain. In this lesson, we're going to go through some of these semantic elements, and we'll cover the rest in the next lesson. So let's say we want to represent a blog post. We can define a div, give it a class, like article or post, doesn't matter. Inside this div, we can have an h1 followed by some text, right? Now, there's nothing particularly wrong with this structure, but we can improve it and make it more meaningful by using semantic elements. So in HTML5, we have an element for representing articles. That is the article element. So if we replace this div with the article element, we're making our markup more meaningful to search engines. Now, this article doesn't have to be a blog post or a newspaper article. It can be any independent, self-contained piece of content. For example, it could be a forum post, user-submitted comments, reviews, product cards, and so on. For example, here on adobe.com, here we can see the showcase of 3 different products. Each product card can be represented using an article element. So an article can be any independent, self-contained piece of content. Now, an article can contain one or more figures like images, tables, lists, and so on. So here we can have an image element, and this is perfectly fine, but we can improve this structure and make it more meaningful by wrapping this image element inside a figure element to tell search engines that this is a figure and not just a regular image. So let's bring up the command palette and use the wrap command to wrap this element inside a figure element. Here's what we get. So the figure element is just a container for figures. It doesn't have any visual characteristics, okay? Now, a figure can optionally have a caption. This caption can be above or below the figure. So here we can add a caption using the fig caption element. But unfortunately, at the time of recording this video, VS Code doesn't recognize this element. So if I press tab, it doesn't generate the tags. So here we have to use a left angle bracket, then close it here to generate these tags. So here we can say my coffee this morning. Now let's save the changes and take a look. So we don't have an image here because I didn't set the source, but you can see an example of a caption. And again, this caption can be above or below the image. So this is an application of the figure element. Now, sometimes we want to highlight our text. In the last lesson, I told you how to do this using the span element. So let's say we want to highlight this lorem. We wrap it inside a span, and then give that span a class like highlight. That's one way to do this. But in HTML5, we have a semantic element for this very reason. That is the mark element. So if you wrap this inside a mark element, we get the same result as before. Our highlighted text has a yellow background color, and we didn't have to explicitly set this color. This is the default style of marked elements. So whenever we want to highlight or mark content, we can use the mark element. Now, one last element we're going to cover in this lesson. Quite often, articles have a published date and time. So below this heading, we can have a paragraph and say published January 1st, 2021 at 5 p.m. This is perfectly fine, but we can wrap this part inside a time component to make it more semantic. So once again, VS Code doesn't recognize the time element. So here we have to manually type a left angle bracket and then close it like this. Now let's move the date and time over here. Good. So if we save the changes, look, our date time doesn't have any visual characteristic. It's displayed like normal text. But our HTML markup better represent the structure of this page. Now here we can optionally set the datetime attribute to a machine-readable datetime. Once again, this can help search engines better extract the necessary information from this page. So here's the format that we have to follow. 2 digits for the year, a hyphen, 2 digits for the month, 2 digits for the day. Now, if you have a time, we add a space and type the time on 24-hour time clock, so 1700. Now, imagine if instead of these semantic elements like article, time, mark, and figure, all we had was divs and spans. Our HTML markup wouldn't be very descriptive, right? So even though the majority of web pages on our internet are built with divs and spans, going forward, it's highly recommended to use semantic elements. We're going to cover more semantic elements in the next lesson. So we covered the basic semantic elements. Now let's look at the elements we use for structuring web pages. Pretty much most web pages have at least 3 building blocks: a header, the main content, and a footer. That's a pretty common structure. Now, sometimes we can have a sidebar for advertising or other content that is not directly related to the main content. So after the main element, we can have an aside element. Now, in the header, quite often we have a navigation bar with a list of menu items. What element do we use to represent this list? We talked about this before. We use an unordered list. So here we can have an unordered list with a bunch of list items, okay? Now, similarly, in the footer, we can have another navigation element with an unordered list. So we can have multiple navigation elements on the same page. Now, sometimes in the main area, we may have multiple sections. For example, we may have a section for showcasing the top products we're selling and another section for the testimonials. So with the section element, we can group related content. Now, every section should have a heading, which is quite often an H2, but that really depends on where we are in the hierarchy of our headings. So here we can say products. So if we don't supply this heading and validate our web page, we'll get a validation error. Now, let's say here we're going to represent the top selling products. What element can we use to represent each product? We talked about this in the previous lesson. We can use an article. With the article element, we can represent any independent, self-contained piece of content. So here we might have multiple article elements. Similarly, in the testimonial section, we may have a heading and a bunch of articles. Once again, we can represent each testimonial using an article. Now, I want to clarify something. Don't assume that this is the only way to structure a web page. This is just an example so you can see the purpose of these semantic container elements. How you use them to structure your web pages really depends on what you have on those pages. For example, here we have multiple articles inside a section, but we can also have multiple sections inside an article. For example, imagine this article is representing a blog post or a newspaper article. Here we can have multiple sections. That's a perfectly valid structure. Also, the header and footer elements don't just represent the header and the footer of the page. We may use them inside a section or an article. Again, it really depends on what we're representing. So let's quickly recap. We use the main element to represent the main content of the page. And that means every page can have only one main element. If we use more than one main element and validate our web page, we'll get a validation error. We use the section element to group related content. We use the header element to represent introductory content, which can belong to the page or a section or an article. The footer element can be used in the same way. And finally, we use the aside element for representing content not directly related to the main content.